you are in the world. I'm Sarah Kagan.
And I'm Ann Shoemaker.
And you've probably seen us if you are participants in Growing Old Around the Globe on Coursera. But I think that some of you may have joined us through Google Hangouts on air spontaneously. If you're not yet a participant in Growing Old Around the Globe, please do go to Coursera and enroll. It's free and it's fun. Join us. And this is our first live weekly webcast for the course. We're really thrilled to be with you on Google Hangouts on air. It's our first time trying this technology out, so we hope that it's working for you. And you might be able to see that Anne has her iPad open and ready. She is following both our Twitter feed and the discussion thread as we're speaking. So if you have a question or an idea you'd like us to discuss, please do go ahead and enter a comment on the discussion thread in Coursera on Growing Old Around the Globe, or tweet us to @OldGlobeMOOC, and we'll get that tweet or that discussion comment, and we'll be able to respond. So, where should we start?
Well, I think we should start to let you know that we are currently 5,944 participants across all continents except Antarctica, aged teens to octogenarians.
And I bet some of you are actually wondering, what does the word octogenarian mean? So here's a little bit of a term tidbit that you can use. Octogenarian means people aged 80 through 89. People who are 90 to 99 years of age are called nonagenarians, and people 100 years of age and older are referred to as centenarians. And centenarians and supercentenarians, those people over 110 years of age, are among the most rapidly growing age groups in many very aged societies today. Oh, and not to leave those of you, because we have a number of participants who are in their 70s, not to leave those of you between the ages of 70 and 79 out, you are referred to in gerontology language as septuagenarians. So just a term that we hope is both interesting and useful to you. And I'm really excited about the fact that we have people from across the globe. And maybe there are some people in Antarctica who haven't responded to the discussion thread that is on week one, that a participant started asking you to identify yourselves on a map, or haven't responded to our survey. And I will just put in a plea. You probably received an email, and you will receive a reminder email with a request to complete our Coursera participant survey, which includes some survey questions that are actually unique. Anne and I developed them for our course specifically. We'd love it if you could take a few minutes and complete that survey and add as much detail about why you're interested in the course and what you hope to learn as you can within the constraints of the survey.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sarah mentioned these terms, septuagenarian, octogenarian, and talking about our older participants, but we were very surprised and happy to learn that there are many participants that are young. I believe the youngest participant that I have seen active in the discussion forums is 14, and we have many, many participants in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. If you would like to participate in this discussion or let people know how old you are, you can answer our survey and we'll post those results.
Absolutely.
And there's also a discussion forum under week one about tell us your age. Let us know how old you are, and maybe give us some reasons about why you took the course.
I think that's a really important connection for why Anne and I, along with our whole team, because we have a really fabulous team of people who are bringing you this course from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and we're spread not around the whole globe, but around part of the globe, from San Francisco to the city of Oxford in England. And our goal was really to get people of different ages, from different walks of life, talking to one another about what it is to grow old, no matter what age you are, because from the time we're born, biologically, we're aging. Psychological and social aging don't kick in right at the time of birth, but certainly biological aging is a process that is embedded within our biology as a person. And we wanted to get people thinking and differentiating ideas about aging, growing old, and what it is to live in an aging society. So it's really exciting to us that we have people, as far as we know, from aged 14 to over 80 in our course and actively participating. I think the numbers of people who have watched videos and are actively participating are around 1,500 or so. I think that was the last thing that Brian and Aram told us, because they help us keep track of those numbers. We also wanted to really encourage you to dive into discussions that you find valuable and important, and to recognize that there's a lot going on, and a number of people have commented on this is a big website with lots of different moving parts, as we say in American English, that can be a little bit difficult to see in its totality. What Ann and I really want to emphasize for people is take advantage of what you enjoy and find most interesting about the course. Don't feel as though I've got to do every single thing and I've got to follow every single element of the course.
And also, we're trying to create this dialogue through different forums. So our discussion forum on the Coursera platform, but also if maybe that's not the way you feel that you communicate best, you can always go to Twitter or connect with other participants through Facebook. We're also asking people to submit video perspectives. So if you already watched week 1, you'll see how we structured our video perspectives with our own friends, family. A lot of the TAs helped participate to bring these together. And we have a tab over on the sidebar to tell you how to best contribute your video perspectives through YouTube, so that we can also foster discussion through these video segments.
And so I will say, for those of you who are not tech savvy, and I am not nearly as tech savvy as Ann and Brian and Aram are in particular, what I would say to you is, so that sidebar is on the left-hand side of your screen, so you can just kind of read down and you'll see video perspectives. And when you go there, recognize that submitting video perspectives requires either an iPhone or an iPad, and you will need to be comfortable enough uploading that video to YouTube. So don't feel as though this is a requirement. This is for people who are comfortable with technology, who'd like to interview friends, family members, or perhaps you've met some other Old Globe participants in your area and all of you want to get together and contribute your own personal responses to the questions for week 2, 3, through 6, through week 6. We're really excited to have your ideas represented in these video perspectives. As Ann noted, we did it ourselves for week 1. But don't feel as though that's an added pressure. Rather, it's an opportunity for those of you who are comfortable with the technology.
We also noted some anxieties people are expressing about the peer evaluations, and we just wanted to address the fact that peer evaluation for us really wasn't about evaluating somebody's work or their analysis of the item for their portfolio they picked. It was more about creating commentary and discussion and reflection, our own reflection. So not so much evaluating somebody else's work, but taking their analysis and reflecting on it back to them so that we further create this dialogue. We can review the point system very quickly.
Let's review the point system. I think Ann's right. So honestly, the way we are thinking about the peer review component of the portfolio is that we have 3 different categories. 2 points is for when you read someone else's portfolio submission. When you read that submission, you say, I really understand this pretty well, and I can respond to it. That's 2 points. If it's not as clearly written, and you're a little bit confused about some of the ideas, that's one point. And if someone really did nothing at all, there's no reflection written by the participant who has uploaded this submission, that's no points. So we tried to make it as easy as possible for you to select a point value, because Coursera really is more about numerical evaluation, and we're asking for people to write their reflections, to write their ideas. So what we did was to create this 3-category system of 2 points: clear, easy to understand, easy to respond to. 1 point, not as clear, not as easy to respond to, and 0 is there's really nothing there. And what we would ask everyone, and we're going to put this in an announcement, is that you be generous. Don't be exacting in, well, I didn't understand every ramification or every consequence of this idea, but rather, if you could read it and respond to it with fair ease, that we ask you to do that as a 2-point peer evaluation. We hope that makes a little bit more sense. We have had some questions about the idea that a statement of accomplishment is gained with an overall score for your portfolio of 10 out of 12 points at minimum. Anne and I are going to talk about that later today, and we'll have a response on the discussion thread. We very much value the commentary of the participants in the discussion thread about the portfolio, and we're going to take a look at that today before the end of the week, before you're going to submit your portfolio assignments. So that we hope that takes away some of your concern and makes it a little bit more enjoyable to participate. We recognize that many of you are extremely serious and very dedicated participants in all of your Coursera courses, and certainly we treasure the fact that you are very active participants in our course. So we want to be sure that we attend to that question, and we will issue an announcement about any changes to the portfolio in relation to the statement of accomplishment. So we hope that makes a little bit more sense. Did we cover everything?
I think so. And again, if you have any more questions, you can always tweet us at Old Globe MOOC, and we can answer those, or post your question to the webcast during the webcast time, or you can always post these questions in the discussion forum as well.
That sounds good. Yeah. What we wanted to do next was to really begin to talk about some of the great ideas that you've submitted both on the discussion forum and on Twitter that you'd like us to talk about. And I'm just looking at Anne's notes because they're actually a little bit better than mine. Let's see. Which one shall we take first? Perhaps one of the earliest ones is one that we can talk about in general terms, because it's an interesting link to some later weeks in the course, and that is that there's been an ongoing thread around same-sex marriage and decreasing birth rates. So the discussion, if you haven't had a chance to check this out, the discussion on this particular question has been quite rich, and it probably, I think for me, it brings up 2 issues, and I'll be interested to hear what you think, Anne. It brings up, first, for me, an idea that a couple of gerontologists, primarily from North America, have thought about, and that is that if we think about life expectancy and longevity, and you probably noticed this on Twitter if you're following, the world's oldest man, the world's oldest person just recently passed away. May he rest in peace. But in general, when we're talking about really long lives, we're talking about women. Women have what we call a survival advantage. Sorry, guys. It's part of genetics, it's part of biology, but wherever we go in the world, we see that there is a survival advantage for women. So a couple of gerontologists have actually wondered whether there will be more same-sex relationships and partnerships for women in very late life, in part because that's a feature of the fact that there are just more women. Now, there's not a lot of compelling evidence out there about this idea, but it is interesting to think about the notion of survival advantage and what are the consequences of that survival advantage, both personally and at the level of community and society. So that's one of the first ideas I think about.
So when I read this question initially, it brought to mind that the actual question was about declining birth rates and if we can contribute some of these declining birth rates to same-sex marriage. So there's many different forces at play here. First of all, we know that there are many advantages in science now and technology that have allowed people to have children even within same-sex partnerships.
Good point, both through adoption and IVF.
Mm-hmm. But we also want to keep in mind that aging population and aging society is based on really the elements of increasing longevity, so increased life expectancy, and declining fertility. Mm-hmm. So that could also mean many different things. So the availability of birth control in certain countries. I was trying to do some research, and I didn't really see anything compelling on the fact that many people now are living in same-sex relationships or same-sex marriages, and that causing a declining birth rate.
I'm not available. I'm not aware of any available evidence that really suggests that same-sex partnerships have had any demographic influence. There's still really a minority force in demographic terms, while they are receiving a very appropriate due consideration at social levels. But another thing this really brings out, while we don't think there's any evidence to suggest that same-sex partnership is really reducing birth rates and contributing to demographic changes, here's something that is really important to think about, and that is that what we in North America and in Europe call LGBTI issues in aging are very important for us to be considering in Old Globe. So that is LGBTI stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. Intersex being the category of identity most recently added. LGBTI aging issues have really received relatively little attention, and this community is such an important community in so many societies, and we need to recognize that because we're looking around the world, there are places in the world where being part of the LGBTI community is actually illegal, and there are other places in the world where there is a great deal of activism on the part of the community, often in areas that sort of intersect with aging. In fact, the BBC, and I'll remember to tweet this when we finish the webcast, the BBC did a very nice piece this morning on its World Service about Outstanding in Business. And Outstanding in Business is a new group that is looking at LGBTI issues in the business world and the business community, helping people who may be not yet out as LGBTI individuals, thinking about their careers. And that brings up, of course, something that we'll be talking about probably throughout the course, which is retirement and what you do for a living and how you do that as you age, because the idea of retiring to leisure may not be a possible in this climate particularly.
That also brings up the point that the LGBTI community has always, I mean, we're all aging, so that community is aging as well. But I think there's a big transition, which with the generation that's coming into older age right now, about how out they were. So previously, these people were bachelors, maybe in heterosexual or marriages. And this population that's changing and having same-sex marriages is now coming into their 70s, 60s, 70s. So how does your government or insurance policies or things kind of form to these different lifestyles, where previously they weren't talked about, maybe they weren't recognized? There's studies happening now about LGBTI awareness in residence homes, nursing homes,
care homes, right?
Assisted living facilities, and how we can be more aware of what's going on and be more sensitive to the needs of other cultural groups, just the same as we're sensitive to the needs of people who are maybe not born in the United States.
Exactly. That sensitivity to individual people's needs really has to be about the whole individual, and that includes sexuality, spirituality, relationships, all sorts of factors that we're probably more comfortable thinking about in many situations as a younger person's issue. But what we are trying to do here is to acknowledge that aging is something that everyone is experiencing. I often used to tell my undergraduate students here at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, as they were sitting listening to me lecture for 3 hours, that in fact their skeletons were aging as I spoke. And that actually got most of them to sit up and pay attention a little bit more, because I don't think that many 20-something people tend to think of themselves as aging. But what we've seen in your discussion posts is that many people who are actively participating in Old Globe in their teens and 20s are saying, I'm aware of the fact that I'm aging. So I think already we're beginning to see a shift in that. And we want to be able to consider all sorts of cultural and personal expressions of life and living life to the fullest, which includes same-sex partnerships, second marriages, third marriages. Many people will outlive spouses and partners and will go on to experience multiple intimate partnerships throughout their lives. So that's something for all of us to, if you will, keep an eye on in this course as we go forward into coming weeks, and think about social aging in particular, but also psychological aging a little bit more specifically.
So another idea that came up in the discussion forums was this idea of anti-aging, and why are we as a society in the United States and some European societies. I know we had a tweet recently about an anti-aging fair in the UK. Why are we afraid of aging? What does aging mean?
Yeah, and you know, Ivona Perchak, who's one of our experts, will kind of talk about anti-aging from her perspective as a plastic surgeon. Anne and I have, personally, we've talked about this quite a bit because, and you may have seen one of her tweets to @OldGlobeMOOC, where we'll even see consumer products, and this probably relates to the thread about consumerism and sort of market-based economy and the issue of appealing to aging or the consideration of aging, and that is, why do we use the term anti-aging? How is that different from rejuvenation, the return to youth? What are those terms really indicating? And I've always thought it's pretty funny to use the term anti-aging, because if you're against something that's an inevitable process, now this is sort of taking things to their illogical extreme, you're almost talking about going against something that is, if you're not aging, the opposite of it is death, right? Aging is when we're dead. So what is it that really pushes the cultural use of anti-aging? There are a number of gerontologists who've looked at anti-aging. So if you're looking for scientific literature in particular, there are a number of people who've dissected the term in lots of different ways. It is certainly more popular if you look at this literature broadly in the medical literature, and there are a number of journals that focus on anti-aging. So that's one thing to consider.
They also use terms like rejuvenative medicine now as well.
It's hard to say.
Common. Yes, sorry.
Rejuvenative medicine. Let's all say it together.
But I always liked the term growing old, because growing denotes thriving and surviving and gaining experience. So you're not declining old, you're growing old.
That's I love that analysis. And you'll notice we did put it in the title of the course. That was intentional. But I really like your allusion to thriving, and we've seen that in a number of the discussion threads, many of which you have started as participants, is that response to aging is, for so many of you, and I think for so many people around the world, about finding value, finding new things, continuing to learn and to be engaged and to contribute. And that's perhaps one of the things that as we go forward in the course, we're really going to have to consider as we get to the future of aging societies, because it is the contributions of people in their much later years that are often devalued and yet can be so incredibly valuable to communities, to families, to organizations. Think about schools and the place of older volunteers or older teachers. So that language is very helpful.
So just a few comments from our participants about same-sex marriage. Letitia says, the world needs all the love it can get. Why should some other person's beliefs have anything to do with other people's lives? There are people still denying the scientific proof that is not chosen but a part of your physical body. The government can set up rules, like you have to be married a certain amount of time. When you have to be married for so many years before you're eligible for their Social Security. So that's an interesting point, and that'll kind of move into weeks 5 and 6 when we also talk about aging and social policy.
Thank you, Letitia, for that, because it really does help us to think about social policy. And perhaps this is because we're nurses. I think Ann and I probably both very strongly agree the world does need all the love it can get. There's a lot of conflict and a lot of strife going on around the world, and there are lots of chronologically, that is, by their birthdays, very old people who probably feel as though they have very little place in the world. And thinking about how we can change that feeling to something more positive is perhaps one of the more powerful outgrowths of this course. And it helps us to think about things as a journey in this course.
Scott also makes a great point about birth rate decline that has gone down for hundreds of years with increased education of women.
Yes.
That began in Europe even before the advent of modern birth control methods. And that is another contribution of
absolutely and
birth rate decline, education.
Yeah, and you probably remember, if you had a chance to watch some of the videos, that our experts, particularly Herb Smith, who will be with us for one of our webcasts, he'll be with us. We're having a webcast on, instead of June 26th, we're changing it to Thursday, June 27th. Herb Smith will be with us for that webcast, and Herb is, as a demographer, a really excellent analyst of that idea that, in fact, probably one of the more important issues in both longevity and aging societies, because remember that, and you'll hear us talk about this a lot more throughout the course, aging societies are not about how long people are living, Rather, they're about declines in birth rate. So the fewer younger people you have in a society, the older the society is, even with somewhat more limited life expectancy. So we can see aging societies in countries where life expectancy is still in the 5th or 6th decade of life. And that's because of declining birth rates and infant mortality. What Herb really points out to us is that education has a lot to do with how long we live, and I think he's going to have a lot to say about how education also influences birth rates. So great comment, Scott.
Dominique makes a little comment here. Talking of media, I noticed recently that BBC World News reporters are frequently quite mature, perhaps over 60, a refreshing change from some channels. Though Dominique hopes it's not because the younger reporters don't want to work in high-risk locations.
Well, yeah, we hope not too, Dominique. That's a great sort of in-the-field observation. And certainly if you want to contribute field video where, for example, you turn the camera on the television and then ask a friend, a relative, a colleague about what you've just seen on the television, like an older reporter or something they're reporting on, that would be wonderful as a video perspective for us.
We have a question from Dallas Fuentes asking, are you aware of any recent studies concerning incarcerated seniors?
Oh, excellent question. In fact, incarcerated seniors, so people over the age of 65 who are in prison, are an incredible concern here in North America, Mexico, Canada, and certainly here in the US, where we have the largest incarcerated population, I believe, in the world. Some people are studying this now, and we can post some links to current evidence, but here's the challenge. As the population in prison becomes very old in many societies, and certainly we're seeing that here in the US, the issues of healthcare, of social welfare, and how to keep these people, particularly if they're incarcerated for long periods of time, how to keep these people in touch with their families, particularly as their family members are also, of course, aging, has become a real practical problem. How do we do this? What do we do? Particularly because I don't think anyone had really thought about, for example, prison health care, and certainly as nurses we see this as prison health care being geriatric care. That is care for older people. But that's the reality in many penitentiaries and prisons across the United States. So people are studying it. There are no really good solutions of which I'm aware. Anne, have you read anything? I don't think anyone solved this.
For incarcerated seniors.
The other thing, of course, and this does relate to a discussion thread that we'll get to probably in subsequent webcasts. People have been talking about death and talking about euthanasia, but one of the things we need to think about is end-of-life care in prisons and penitentiaries, because many inmates will in fact live out their lives, particularly with long sentences, but also for people, if you're here in North America, the trial of a very infamous mobster, Whitey Bulger, started in Boston this week. He's 81 years old, and he has said through his lawyers that he fully expects to live out his life in prison. He's an example of someone who will need end-of-life care. He expects to die in prison, and that means we need to be providing practical health care as well as social and spiritual support for people who, like him, will end their lives there. So really great question and very timely.
I just wanted to point out one question. Karen Caverno tweeted us that she's interested in more discussion on stress, autoimmune, and inflammation relationships in the webcast, which is actually a great question for Dr. Kelly Jordan Shudo, who will be joining us next week for the webcast. We're going to save that one for next week.
Yes, Kelly is joining us live next week. As you probably noticed when you watched her interview, she is a lovely, lovely person. We're thrilled that she's going to walk across campus. So we're here in the School of Nursing, and just west of us is the dental school. Kelly's going to walk over and join us here in Claire Fagan Hall. So we're very excited to have her for next week's webcast. So great question, and that's something that Kelly can really speak to very well.
We have another question from Caro Khan about, could you cover in your course ideas about primary prevention of chronic diseases such as diabetes, please? Well, we're not really focused on talking about things like primary prevention. That's more about a course on healthy aging. This has come up in the discussion forums about how as we age, we become more susceptible to certain illnesses or chronic diseases, or even, this hasn't come up yet, but cancer diagnoses.
Right, right. And you know, Caro, that is a really great topic. And of course, as nurses, we're very interested in it. What we tried to do with Growing Old Around the Globe was to make it more about understanding the foundational concepts of aging so that we could think about psychological and social aging and implications around the world. So we kind of deliberately steered a little bit away from health. But what I think your question brings up is a nice connection for Kelly. And what we'll do for Kelly Jordan Shudo is we're going to email your question and the question on stress and the immune system to her in advance so that she can be thinking over this coming week about those ideas, because probably the best place to connect with chronic non-communicable diseases like diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, as well as diseases that Professor Ruben Gur talks about a little bit more in the brain, thinking about Parkinson's and dementia, is for us to sort of make the connection between aging processes, senescence, and the development of those chronic non-communicable disease in terms of stress, particularly oxidative stress, epigenetic issues. So the epigenetic idea is that as you live and as you experience and experience interaction with your physical environment, certain parts of your genome, your genetic material, will be turned on or off. And that's where I think the connection for Kelly Jordan Shudo, Professor Jordan Shudo, is really an expert in that. So we'll email her those two questions, and we'll use that as the foundation for next week's webcast. So thanks to both of you for those questions.
Melanie also tweeted us wondering if membership in a religious or spiritual community might be helpful in healthy aging and lessen isolation. This also kind of ties to incarcerated seniors, the isolation that that people often experience, even within the community, happens in incarcerated adults of any age, maybe even more so in seniors.
That is a great question, and there is quite a bit of research that looks at both religiosity and spirituality. So religiosity, really the idea of active engagement with a formal religion, as opposed to spirituality, the idea that you have a sense of the human spirit that is connected with belief systems which may or may not be associated with a formal religion. But spirituality and religiosity are pretty hot topics in aging research. We do have quite a bit of evidence that suggests that social isolation in general is bad. That is, that people who don't have social contacts, who don't have social engagement, I guess is a way to say it, are more at risk. They're more at risk for illnesses like depression. They're more at risk for declining physical function. and that social engagement need not be physical in person. One of the advantages, and this has been a thread on Facebook, or a couple of posts on Facebook, Sarah Strauss-Berger noted the use of technology. So technologies, communication technologies, can really overcome social isolation. We do also have a sense that members of religious communities can be very long-lived. And in fact, this relates to a very famous study, the Nun study, which enrolled a large number of Roman Catholic sisters and looked at their health outcomes, their diseases like cancer, heart disease, dementia, and also looked at psychological and social functioning, is perhaps the classic study that shows us about connections of religious community membership and aging. But there are probably, there are many other studies. There are probably many ways to look at the influence of religion and aging on one another. It's an interactive process.
Mm-hmm. And there's many components to this. There's the relationship with this being, a spiritual being. Mm-hmm. There's the community relationships. Often in religious communities, there's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly meeting times where people are checking in on the community with each other.
Yeah, so there are lots of different ways to think about religion and aging, and there are manifold implications of that interaction.
And actually in week 4, when we talk more about aging well, Dr. Liz McKenzie and Dr. Amy Corcoran speak to both social isolation and spirituality throughout the lifespan and at the end of life. So you really want to check out those videos if you're interested in this topic.
Yeah, so we'll be, remember, as we go on, those week 4 videos will be up soon. And the other exciting thing is that both Liz and Amy will be joining us for a webcast, and they're very excited about that. I noticed, in fact, yesterday that one of our participants, thank you, Old Globers, for feedback. It helps us all. Someone had commented on the value of Dr. Liz McKenzie's expertise, and in doing that, I forwarded that comment back to Liz, and she was just thrilled to receive it. So I think she's even more looking forward to the webcast.
So we have a tweet. Elena asks, can a career in the third age be the paradigm shift to active and healthy aging and retirement?
Oh, Elena, that is a provocative and exciting question for us.
And probably controversial, because I'm sure there are many people who are looking very forward to their retirement and not having a career anymore.
Yeah, you know, I just recently had this conversation with a friend from college and his colleague. They're in the newspaper business, in the communications business, and I was saying, you know, I think, and I often put this idea out there, in part to start conversations, because obviously there is no absolute here, but I often say, well, I think that retirement, at least in North America, is a 20th century. That retirement as we knew it, think about this. Here in America, for example, retirement only became possible when we reached a critical point in our industrialization and we reached a critical point in our life expectancy, so that people were actually living in great numbers past the point of their active work. And much of that work in the middle of the 20th century here in America was still agricultural work. And remember, in America, in 1900, we started with a life expectancy in the 40s. In the 1950s, we'd reached the 60s. And that's really when retirement became a social phenomenon, and we saw communities like Sun City, Arizona, which is, I think, the first retirement community in America, Sun City, Arizona, come on the map, so to speak. And so this idea of a career in the third age, and what it is to have more than one career because you're living long enough to do that, is provocative from 2 dimensions. One is But wait, I wanted to retire. I wanted my leisure time. The other is, and this is what my colleagues in the newspaper business commented upon, well, what does that mean for younger workers? And certainly as we look at the European Union and unemployment among youth, we do have to consider whether younger workers will be closed out if older workers are staying in the same jobs. But here's something I really want to pose to people that we can continue to talk about both online and in the webcasts, and that is, maybe we're not talking about older workers staying in the same jobs. Maybe what we're talking about is productivity and contributions in different roles, in mentorship roles, in advisory roles, in places where expertise and wisdom can really come to the fore and, in fact, help younger workers.
If you're interested in this topic of retirement, there was actually a very interesting documentary filmed in the United States in Florida, in Delray Beach, which is actually in this country is where for probably the last 2 or 3 decades, people have gone to retire. They're snowbirds, maybe they spend their winter in nice sunny locations so they don't have to deal with the shoveling snow or things like that, or they find a permanent retirement home, but often that's the way away from their families.
Yes.
And what were those implications when people were actually living 10, 15, 20 years past retirement, and maybe they couldn't live on their own anymore? And this documentary, King's Point, which aired on HBO, not sure if it's available to everyone. I think you can purchase it on some websites, really poignantly looked at retirement in this country and current what's happening now. With retirement.
That's right. That is a great documentary. And maybe what we can do, in addition to posting and tweeting Outstanding in Business, we'll post and tweet about the King's Point documentary, because I think that would be very interesting to many participants. And as we're thinking about retirement, one of the comments that Sunny Magalong, who's actually an undergraduate student here at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing and is one of our teaching assistants, noted is that there's a lot of interest in topics that could be courses in and of themselves. And in fact, death and euthanasia are probably so huge that they deserve separate courses of their own. So we're going to try to talk about death, and Amy Corcoran actually talks about living well and dying well, and she, I'm sure, will comment on that in the webcast. But we did want to note that death is something that we're going to talk about as part of aging. Obviously, we all live until we die, and dying is inevitable for every human being. But we're not sure we can do the topic full justice. But we in no way want to avoid it. The topic of that thread is, why is no one saying the D word? But we did notice that a number of people introduced themselves by talking about experiences caring for dying parents or other family members, and we think that that will really enrich our dialogue.
We have another comment on the discussion forum asking you to comment on the way different societies have found ways to use the experience and wisdom of older people to fulfill children's needs, which answers many questions about social engagement, social isolation, and this kind of third age career, or this post-retirement career.
Yeah.
For example, in India, one city has started a link between a senior residence and an after-school homework help program where children come to seniors who work with them. This would be especially useful since many families have working parents who may not have the time and energy to do this.
Yeah.
And I know of one instance, and I can't think of it right now, and I'll definitely put it on the discussion forum, of there was a preschool. It was in the Midwest in the United States, of a preschool that was also held at a adult, either it was adult day center or a nursing home, so that there was constant social interaction between young children, toddlers, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, and older adults who may have some minor disabilities.
Yeah.
But were easily able to interact with the children.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps one of my most favorite examples of how aging societies can begin to look at things differently. Intergenerational daycare. So care for older folks who kind of need a little bit more support but are still very vibrant and wise individuals, and very young dependent children often have somewhat similar needs in a physical sense. Everybody needs to eat meals together. Everybody needs time to learn, no matter what age we are. And so intergenerational daycare programs, while they haven't been as successful, frankly, as I wanted them to be, have popped up in both Canada and here in the United States. And they're often run, for example, by religious groups who have both a senior program and a preschool or a crèche or nursery program. So I think that's one of the best ways to institutionally think about this. The other way to think about it is, in some societies, this is really a matter of necessity. We so often see in today's global economy that parents of young children, whether they're single parents or parents who are partners, really have to be dual income couples. That is, both people need to be out working. And that means that grandparents have to provide childcare in many, many societies and in many communities in every society. I certainly have a number of friends and colleagues who are lucky enough to have their parents living nearby, and their children are provided care by those grandparents. And then we can look at other societies like China, for example, where when I speak with my Chinese colleagues, it's certainly in rural China almost expected that grandparents will be providing direct child care, because not only are both parents working, at least one parent may have migrated to a city to provide a better income for the family.
And in my experience here in the United States of home care, participating in home care for adults and elderly, I've noticed that I grew up in a home with 3 generations, but more and more we're seeing 4 and 5 generations all living in one home together. And there might be a child who needs care taking, or there might be 2 generations of older adults that may have chronic illnesses. So this whole idea of the sandwich generation that we're talking about here is really growing to a whole new level of different generations living in one family. And you may be needing some care by your child, but then you might also be the caregiver for your grandchildren, and all these multiple roles.
And it's not a simple sandwich anymore.
No.
It also is important to think about this in historical terms. So for those of you around the world, think about what's true in your society, but Ann and I can tell you the American story. So there's an American myth almost that we used to live in multi-generation households, mostly on farms, in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. Well, if you look at life expectancy, remember we mentioned that life expectancy here in America in the year 1900 was in the early 40s. Sorry, I can't remember the exact age. But if we're talking about the early 40s, and the age of fertility was somewhat different, but not distinctly earlier. In fact, the age of menarche for girls, so the age at which girls become fertile, has actually become younger, not older. So if you think about this, then that means that really is a myth. We didn't live in multi-generational families in a single house in rural America in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. In fact, people were dying primarily of infectious diseases, infections like pneumonia, influenza in 1918 in the global pandemic, much more commonly. Now, not only have we seen increases in average life expectancy, but we've also seen increases in longevity, so that it's not just 2 generations, it's 3, 4, and 5, as Anne has pointed out. So that myth is being busted today, and it also means that today's children, and we certainly see this with our college students today, are much more likely to have had experience being cared for by grandparents and to perhaps have lived with grandparents and great-grandparents. So it's an exciting time to think about capitalizing on wisdom, because now we actually have the opportunity, because of better health, better longevity, and better life expectancy.
We have one last question because we're going to wrap up. So Mike Medina asks about older men and depression. And how do you think we can get older men to accept treatment for depression, particularly in the United States, where men are reluctant to admit weaknesses and seek treatment? Do you think this is a worldwide issue?
Oh, good question. Again, a little bit outside the scope of Growing Old Around the Globe, Mike, but an important one, because depression is, while it's certainly a biological illness, it's also something that influences both psychological well-being and social engagement and social relationships. That's a good question. I would have to look at the literature to be sure that the issue of depression among older men is as pronounced here in America and around the world. I don't know the exact statistics on depression in older men just off the top of my head. But what I would say is there are lots of ways to not make depression a matter of failure, and very often it's been presented as, oh, you have a problem, we can fix you. You haven't been able to fix yourself. You've failed to fix yourself. So there are lots of more creative ways to approach people, both men and women, who are uncomfortable talking about mental health as a problem. And there are lots of organizations around the world that are looking at that, both at depression and suicide among older individuals. And what are your thoughts?
Well, I brought up the question. I saw Mike responded to us because I think this is something that is becoming more recognized, and as the population ages, because as we know, incidence of depression increases with age. So it's something that we need to be looking for as our population ages, and it also connects with these other topics we're talking about today of isolation and engagement, and also feeling about how you feel about your own aging. And maybe things we would like you to talk about more in the discussion forums, like experiences of ageism or age discrimination.
Very much.
But I think this issue of depression will come up again in week 4 when we talk about aging well. Absolutely. And I really would like to continue this discussion through then.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, Anne, because we can see depression as a disease, as an illness to be treated, or we can see depression as an opportunity to rethink social relationships and engagement, and to understand that isolation for people of all ages is an incredibly dangerous thing. And perhaps one of the side benefits of Growing Old Around the Globe is that all of us will feel part of a larger community around the world, and that we'll all feel somewhat less isolated, because certainly we know we have a number of participants who have to spend most of their time at home or most of their time in a retirement home, and we hope that this course can provide both a sense of social interaction as well as a learning opportunity. So I think we're just about out of time.
Yep, our time is up today. We would like to thank everyone for joining us on our first webcast for Growing Old Around the Globe. And I will see you next week with Dr. Kelly Jordan-Shudo, and hopefully Sarah will be able to connect with us, as she will be in the UK.
Yes, I'm going to try my very best to increase my technology savvy and join you for the webcast. But if I don't, I know I'll be watching it on YouTube as an archive. So for those of you who have not been able to join us live, and I hope you're watching this webcast archived on YouTube as well. Until next week, thanks so much, and keep up the great discussions. Bye-bye.